CEO of the Essential Services Commission and Chair of the Negotiated Electricity Connections Governance Committee, which has been running for nearly 2 years. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all of the lands that we might be meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to acknowledge the connection that Indigenous Australians hold to country and culture, particularly in this time of great uncertainty. Before we start with this Zoom public forum, could I just remind you of some basic Zoom courtesy things. We'll have you on mute to start out with, so if you're not on mute, could you please put yourself on mute? That would be great, so that we can avoid the background noise. And if you're comfortable with it, it would be great if you could put your camera on so we can help us, so we can see your face, which is always nice in these forums, but that's of course up to you. During the course of the session, if you want to ask a question at any point or contribute, what would be great is if you could use the hand raising function, which is in your on the participants bar, and then we can identify who wants to contribute and point you in that direction. Also wanted to let you know that we are recording the meeting so that we've got something that will help us with note taking at the end of it all, so that's just for your information. So I'd like to welcome you all here this afternoon. It's great to see the number of representatives we have from all of our major stakeholder groups. For those of you who might not know, we're the Essential Services Commission of the state's independent economic regulator. We are responsible for regulating aspects of energy, water, local government and transport sectors, as well as the Victoria Energy Upgrade Scheme. We began our work on negotiated connections back in 2018. This was when we were asked by the government to provide our advice on ways we could improve the timeliness of connections and greenfield areas. At the time, back in 2018, construction of housing lots, you'll remember, in the growth areas was at record highs, and the government was concerned about delays in connecting new developments was affecting housing affordability. We heard back then that delays were due to things like rapid growth in new lots constructed and resource constraints, inadequate customer focus of distribution businesses, auditing practices of some distribution businesses, and the management of technical standards set for industry, and the poor quality of civil works. So we worked together with industry at the time to develop practical solutions to try and help overcome these delays. And most of those were included in what we called a service improvement commitment, which was a voluntary commitment that the distribution businesses signed up to. We established a governance committee to oversee the implementation of those service improvement commitments. The committee comprised of members of the UDIA, who are here today, the Property Council as well, the Victorian Planning Authority, City Power, Powercorp, United Energy, AusNet Services and Gemini. So I'd like to particularly thank all the members of the committee over this period for their continuous work in providing timely updates about the progress that we've been making towards delivering initiatives and insights and where those improvements are being seen in the field. Just to give you a sense of that, what improvements we have seen to date, many initiatives have been implemented with the oversight of the committee. These include improving stakeholder consultation and communication, significant investment in IT systems so that developers can more easily track the progress of individual projects and communicate with distribution businesses about how that's going. We've looked at improving transparency about the connections process through 6 monthly public performance reporting, and so far we've seen some improvements in time deliveries through that reporting process. There's also been reviewing audit processes, improving problematic practices. So Powercorp has removed the walk-off policy, which was causing some concerns out there, and AusNet Services has increased their auditor pool and resources. The distribution businesses have also established a technical standards committee to try and harmonise standards so that contractors know how to build an estate, so contractors know what the standards are, no matter if they're in the AusNet or Powercorp or Gemini jurisdictions. To date, the committee has made good progress and is about to release a draft report for comment, which we understand begins trials in October. There was also been increasing resources required to undertake connections work, and we understand some distribution businesses have increased staff in their contestable works teams as well. So there's been some really good progress, and we hope that that has been experienced out in the field. However, we're still hearing that there's a call for some improvements, and there are issues with quality of civil works. So that's been the work to date from our perspective. We're now at the stage where we want to see these improvements continue and be sustained in the long term. This would also give more investment certainty to builders and developers. This is particularly important in the moment to help the building and development and land development sector make their contribution towards the state's economic recovery post-coronavirus, although it might not feel exactly post today. To facilitate that, we've released an issues paper outlining 4 potential options. And obviously, if you think there could be other approaches, please feel free to raise them. But before we start our discussion today, we thought it would be really good if we could have, I'd like to ask Matt Thomas from PowerCore and Danny Hunter, CEO of the UDIA, to give their reflections on the progress made to date by the Governance Committee and where they see further need for improvement. So I've just asked them to maybe talk for 3 or so minutes each on their reflections on that. And if I might maybe start with Matt, that would be great. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you, John. I'll apologise in advance because I got told 5 minutes. But
5 minutes.
So I'll try not to take too long. So thank you. So I suppose everybody on the call would know who we are and what we do, but now I've got a phone ringing. As an essential service provider, we play a critical part in, or a critical role in supporting growth within Victoria. But some of the things that we focus on, providing a safe, reliable and cost-effective electricity supply to around 1.1 million homes and businesses across Victoria. And that's roughly somewhere around 2.3 million Victorians rely on us for that. We undertake a pretty wide range of connection projects, from everything from large-scale solar and wind through to individual houses within a development, and obviously the greenfield housing estates play a part in that. What's a little bit different for us, we tend to do most of our own works in the greenfield estate. What is different is the developer obviously engages a contractor to install the assets, and then we effectively purchase that asset at the end of the development. So that's what makes these projects different. And just some of the sort of larger metrics across the first half of 2020, we've connected just north of 12,400 new customers across our area and tied in 290 new housing estate stages. So, and when you think that within those housing estates, every house goes on to become a new customer, it's a significant part of the work that we do. I became involved in this process a bit over 12 months ago when I took over the contested works team owing to someone in our group getting a promotion. Within that time, so within the time that I've been involved, we've seen, in terms of improvement in our process, we've seen the overall time where we're within the process, or when the process is waiting upon us to do something, to fall from somewhere around 80 days down to currently below 30 days. A lot of that's due to some of the process changes that we've made. But just to give a scale of that, across the 290 projects that we've seen this year, if you multiply that out, that's 20,300 days less that we've been involved in development projects than we would have been previously last year. So with the service improvement commitment and the governance process, so we listen to the industry and we work collaboratively with them to make these improvements. People who've operated in our patch would hopefully be aware that we've made an investment in an online portal, My Supply, which has given anybody who's involved as a stakeholder in the project now has full visibility of what's going on within PowerCore, and it acts as a workflow too. So it's certainly made a difference to us internally, and we hope that it's made a difference to those outside who are using it. gives the ability to see the current status of the project. John talked about the tech standards harmonisation, and that's a piece of work, and that will be going out to be field tested, I'm told, in late October. So that will be a big step forward. That'll be really positive. The master planning process. So this is probably something that doesn't get talked about as much as it possibly should, because this is something that's really unlocked a heap of savings through a development. So like I said before, we listened to the industry, and the industry told us they wanted the ability to be able to do the master planning. So we made some changes to allow that. That's handed control of that process to the developer. But what's really significant about it is once you've got your master plan, you no longer need to wait at each stage of your development to get a new scope. So that unlocks significant savings through a development. It's actually probably possible to take design completely off your critical path if you were able to organise your affairs that way. Our design auditing, so, that was one of the processes we looked at improving. So we've sort of stabilised our turnaround times at around 16 days, and we've seen a lift within the industry in quality, particularly there's a couple of design houses who are now consistently have maintained 100% first audit pass rate and been able to do that for quite some period of time, which proves that we're not setting an impossible task there. There's probably still some more improvement within the industry. We only get about, it's slightly below 70% pass first up, so there's room to improve there. The construction audits you talked about before, John, so, the walk-away policy, we've completely ditched that. We've got our audits down to 5 days. Again, there's not a huge pass rate where an estate's ready to connect at the end of the first audit, but the overwhelming majority of projects don't require a second audit. Rather, they just require some rectification works to be sent in. So that process has certainly improved, but there's probably more to do there. And our practical completion and statement of consent process, and this is where the My Supply portal's really made a difference, because we no longer rely on emails going back and forth. Everything's done through the portal. We're now turning around practical completion inside of 2 days, and statement of consent would often be issued on the day it's requested, which would be, and I'm sure the industry guys here would agree, that would be a significant improvement on where we were. So those things are all things that have been a result of this process, and those things they may have happened, but they certainly wouldn't have happened to the same degree and with the same speed as with this process. So just in closing, we've made some significant improvements to support the development industry, but we know there's more to do, right? There's more opportunities to improve and to work together. And particularly, I could just throw out training and skills and development within the civil industry and within the cable installation would be an area maybe we could focus on. And this process, the ESC service improvement commitment process, that's been the catalyst for us to engage with the industry, and it was probably something that we hadn't done enough of, but we feel that that's led to some successes for everybody, and it's been very positive. And just again, to close, I would say there's more to do. There's plenty more to do, and we'd look forward to working with the development industry to do it. Thank you.
Mute myself. Thanks, Matt. So before we start discussion, I'll hand over to Danny, who was going to say a few words as well, I think.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Danny Hunter, the Victorian Chief Executive at the Urban Development Institute of Australia. And we've been very capably represented by a couple of our wonderful committee members, John Forbes and Stephen Waters, through the governance committee through the process. So you'll likely know their faces more so than mine. And I just wanted to give them a shout out, but also thank Matt for his contribution just then. It was a really great overview of where the process has brought us to, in terms of coming leaps and bounds to where we were 2 years ago. I think, from the UDIA's perspective, there has never been a more important time for this issue to be continually addressed and improved. We think that whilst John's introductory comments spoke to the large number of greenfield lots that were being developed in 2018 and at the time when this review was undertaken, that the emphasis on greenfield development has not at all waned. And in fact, the importance of the point in time being at the statement of compliance stage, where the distribution businesses and the development industry connect physically and metaphorically, is such an incredibly important time in getting that housing on the ground and to purchasers, so that they can actually start building the new home that they then move into. Now, it's more important now than ever, largely because of the home builder package, and particularly because of the narrow timeframe that the home builder package has introduced. There's going to be a phenomenally intense period ahead of our civil contractors, our developers, and our distribution businesses as they work over the next sort of 6 and 12 months to deliver lots that have been purchased and demand that has been brought forward in the housing market to be able to take advantage of that home builder package. And, at a very sort of high level, the faster that connections happen and the quicker that lots get to people, the more chance we have that there are more Victorians that can take advantage of that home builder grant. So we think it's an incredibly important time to be at this pointy end of the discussion, because whilst our industry may not boom the way it necessarily was in 2018 over the next few months and years, we will have an intense period of production ahead of us. So we're keen to continue this important conversation. We're working very hard internally on a significant submission to the Essential Services Commission, but have continued the conversation with other government authorities and agencies around this very important issue of connections with respect to electricity, gas and water, and have most recently been working with the Building Victoria's Recovery Task Force to make sure that their attention is on issues like this as well. Because, as I said before, those connections are the most important hurdle between land development and a purchaser taking ownership of that lot and building that house that they so desperately want to build and get into. So I'm pleased to be a part of the conversation. As I said, we think that there needs to be more done, as Matt also alluded to, but I think we have a really great fundamental foundation of collaboration and dialogue now that we didn't have 2 years ago. And whilst you might not have seen me at this table in the last 18 months as often as John Forbes and the others, Merrin will know from good experience that I've been around these tables for near on 15 years in various roles talking about this issue and other connections issues. So we have a really good internal understanding of what industry wants, but also where we need to get to working in collaboration with regulators like the ESC and other government agencies and the distribution businesses as well. So an important discussion to keep having. There is more to do, and we look forward to being part of the solution.
That's fantastic. Thanks for those comments, Danny. I just noticed before we go on to the next stage, Matt, there's a question from Andrew in the comments. Says, does your portal talk to Sphere, or do you still need to access Sphere to issue SOC? So I wonder if you give a very quick answer to that question before we move on.
Yeah, no, the statement of compliance is still issued via Sphere. Yep.
Cool, thanks. Look, I really appreciate both of your comments, Matt and Danny, and also the commitment of everyone to work collaboratively to continue to work on this and improve it, particularly in the context of the various economic recovery packages that are coming down the line. So we're now moving on to the discussion on the options paper that we've released for consultation. Your contributions today will help us decide on the best way to give developers some certainty and improve the timeliness of connections while not compromising safety and reliability of connections in the wider network. So this session is really about early feedback on the pros and cons of the approaches. We haven't deliberately put up a preferred option, and there's no need to see this forum as committing your organisation to a position here today. So this is us seeking early input, and obviously we look forward to submissions, written submissions at the next stage of the process. So I'd like to introduce you all to Aaron Ewan, who most of you will know, hopefully, Senior Regulatory Manager, Energy Reform and Analysis, who will introduce the session on issues paper. So welcome, Aaron.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Danny and Matt, for your reflections as well at the start. As I think everyone's alluded to, discussion's really helpful and useful in this sort of environment in our context. Hopefully the issue, or the options, or the issues paper that we presented out gives you some tangibility to what could happen next. So what we're basically going to use the next hour to do is really facilitate some discussions. That's very useful for us when we think of deliberations. We find these forums extremely useful. You might find it useful as well for your own considerations, whether that's putting it out here to inform some of our thinking now, or even to help your written submissions to us as well. Just to let you know how we're going to structure this, Marion, who's been involved in this journey since 2018, she'll just provide a presentation of some of the options that we put out on that paper, and then we'll pause. I'll facilitate some discussions. I'll have a few prompting questions that I think might just help structure the discussion and get us going. You can feel free to ask questions along the way, and then Marion will go and present the next approach, and then I'll come back and we'll prompt some questions from there. So without further ado, I'll pass to Marion just to introduce the approaches, and then we'll go into some discussion.
Thank you, Aaron. I'll just share my screen now with the slide presentation. Where is the share screen? There it is. Can people see the slideshow?
Not yet, but might come.
Is it there now?
No, not yet, Marion.
Not yet.
Have you selected the right view?
Sorry, have I selected the right me?
The right view?
Oh, the right view, sorry. Yes, I should have. So share screen. Is that working now?
That's working now.
There you go. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so as Aaron said, and John, we've developed 4 possible approaches to help address the many themes that we've heard over the last 18 months. And what we've heard is that developers like certainty, they like timeliness and transparency about connections, but that has to be done taking into account quality, and that's one of the distribution businesses' key focuses, is to make sure that quality is maintained with new connections, because as Matt said, ultimately they take ownership of these assets. So we've tried to adopt those 4 themes into our approaches. Some approaches that may be more obvious that a particular theme's there, but nevertheless we've tried to incorporate them into all of them. So the 4 approaches are largely, the first 2, A and B, are largely to continue on with some public performance reporting. Approach A is to continue on with the voluntary reporting that we're currently doing under the service, or the DBs are currently doing under the service improvement commitment. And approach B is to put some obligations in our codes to require that reporting to continue on by the distribution businesses. Approach C is a more of a general obligation around good management and governance about negotiated connections, and that would be supported by guidance on what we expect good management would look like. And approach D is actually regulating the time that would take to do certain steps in the negotiated connections process. So I'll start off with approaches A and B because they're both really about public reporting, and pull them together, and then we'll do a discussion on both of those. So approach A really, as I said before, just continues on with the voluntary reporting that the distribution businesses are doing each 6 months to us on on how long it takes to complete different stages in the negotiated connections process. And those stages include things like the time to do tie-ins, the times to do design reviews, the time to do audit, from the time an audit's requested to the time the audit's actually carried out. What we've noted with this sort of reporting is that each of the DBs reports different measures because the processes vary slightly across the distribution businesses. So obviously there are different measures for each distribution business. What we have noted through the governance committee is that developers welcome the DBs reporting their performance because it shines a light on that performance, but it also encourages the developers to review their processes to help those processes run more smoothly. We feel that this approach increases the transparency and obviously it gives public accountability for how long it takes each of these stages to take, because these reports are currently published on our website, and we also discussed them in the governance committee, and as John said, representatives from the development committee are there. Because this is a voluntary arrangement, we allow the DBs to set their own performance measures, so they can change those measures relatively quickly to reflect changes in processes or new stakeholder expectations in around the time it should take to complete those steps. We feel that the DBs could use this performance reporting to provide more information on their website to give developers some indicative or non-binding idea of how long it would take to do different steps. And then on the other hand, developers could take that information and use that in their planning processes about how long they expect things to take, and then they can facilitate things to happen around those timeframes. But of course, because it's a voluntary agreement, one of the key things that would need to happen to make this work over the longer term is that the management of the distribution businesses would need to make a commitment for this to be ongoing. And obviously they would need to have all the right governance arrangements in place to make sure that the reporting happened and the reports were shared with the development industry and then published. So that's really approach A, which is a voluntary measure, a voluntary way of continuing on with performance reporting. Approach B is very similar, but the main difference is we would actually place a requirement in our electricity distribution code that would require the distribution businesses to do this public reporting and publish. So that's one of the key differences. And instead of the distribution businesses actually setting the measures, we would, with consultation with industry, set the measures and the targets. This sort of performance reporting is average performance reporting, and it measures the time on average over a period of time to complete certain steps. So we could do it that way, or the other way we could potentially do it is say that, for example, and that's the second bullet point, 90% of, say, audits should occur within a maximum time frame of 10 business days. And that's just an example of how that could work. And I guess with this sort of performance measuring, we wouldn't, instead of just reporting numbers, we would also require the distribution businesses to publish some information on why targets were not being met and what sort of remedial action they were taking to address those, address non-compliance over the longer term with those targets. Of course, we could have penalties for not complying with the obligation to report on time, but that's really going to be a decision for government to make whether or not there would be penalties. But through our role as the regulator, we could continue to monitor performance and adjust or amend timeframes and measures as required to make sure that meeting stakeholder expectations. So they're the first two approaches. So now I'll hand over to Aaron to ask some questions.
That's good. Thanks, Mary. And at this point, we've done a lot of talking. So now this is where you can throw your ideas and discussions on as well. There's a few ways you can do it. Just raise your hand, and I'll signal it to you, and feel free to speak, or send us a chat message as well, and I can reflect that on as well. Just following on from what Maren's presented, many of you have probably seen the data that distributors have been reporting publicly to date. From a numbers perspective, they seem to signal improvement. But just reflecting on what's been published, from your experience, have you actually seen those improvements? Does that match up with the numbers that's come through? Maybe it's just a first question for anyone. And maybe as an extension to that question, do you need more information? What sort of information do you need? Lots of silence so far.
Aaron, I'm having trouble figuring out how to raise my hand and to do the chat to you all without it showing up privately. This is Patrick Perlman with the Commission. One of the questions I had is, in looking at Approach B, it looks to me like Approach B is actually could be two parts. I mean, the first part could be, in fact, requiring a reporting obligation on the distributors. And then, if you will, sort of B+ would be including performance indicators or benchmarks. And then I suppose double+ would be going on to actually requiring penalties. But it would seem to me that the obligation, making it an obligation to report, would be potentially an initial first step. The others could be added to it or could be all done at the same time. Am I correct in that view?
Yeah, I think there's a sequencing of things in this. I think the main important bit here is about, about the usefulness of reporting. In this case, there's a few different mechanisms that you can do about it, and what you can actually report on could be talked about as well. Apparently, Stephen Waters, you may have had your hand up.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so it's Steve Waters, and I work for SMEC Australia, but I'm actually representing the UDA in this venue. My point I think I wanted to make in relation to those two approaches was that it's really good when we measure those key indicators. And I must admit that there has been some big improvements that we've noticed in the last 2 years. So yeah, shout out to the power companies with that. I think that there's a couple of other steps in the process that sometimes get missed though. And if you're only reporting on those few key indicators, you can still get the situation where the statement of compliance is delayed at the end. And the ones I'm thinking of are the plan of subdivision certification can sometimes take a long time. And it doesn't matter how quickly you're doing your design or your other steps, the whole process still takes longer than it should. So either we even need to add some more steps in there or measure the entire length of approvals through the whole course of the project development.
Thanks, Steve. And is there you mentioned the sort of the final step to get the SOC statement of compliance. Are there other sort of key areas that you think might be missing in terms of reporting? And
for me, it was the certification of the plan of subdivision was a key one, because if we don't get that certified, we can't get our civil engineering plans approved by council. So that just stops that whole process. And that means we can't start construction of the works as well. So if we can just get all those key processes measured in terms of timeframes, that would be helpful.
Thanks, Steve. Danny, yes.
Hi, I too can't find my hand thing, so
physical rating is fine.
So I'm using my actual hand. I think the hand thing is like a webinar one, so you might actually not have the function on this, or it might just be me. and Stephen who can't find it. Listen, I think that, yeah, absolutely acknowledge that we've come a long way since 2018, but I think it's worth saying it was a very low base. It was a very difficult situation for all stakeholders, because it was unclear when things were not being done, what could be done, and what time frame. We had no data around timeframes and the rest. So this exercise has been really useful in starting to collate and establish a baseline set of data. Our concern as an organisation is just really around the voluntary nature of that reporting, and I think this point has been made before. It is all very well and good while we have this Essential Services Commission process and governance structure set up, that we're seeing really good responses on all sides of the equation. But our concern would be that if this process was not to continue and the voluntary nature of reporting was also not upheld as rigorously as it is at the moment, that we would likely have concern that we could go backwards again. So you'll see in our submission there is an emphasis on away from voluntary reporting and instead required reporting, and an expansion of that reporting and targets into areas, as Stephen's just mentioned, like really key sort of critical points for the development industry.
Thanks, Danny. Just note on the chat box as well, I've got a few comments, one from Andrew Webber and one from Andrew Cook. I'll just read these out. Some others might have some thoughts. Have there been any agreed standards on timeframes across distributors? What does each distributor have to aim for so that they can be benchmarked against each other? So I guess a question is, right now, as context on the public reporting, there's sort of different things that are measured across different distributors. Could there be a benchmarking exercise that's done? Andrew's just notes, Steve, my thoughts on certification are all related to good master planning. If there's a good electrical master plan in place, there should be little delay in certification. So it's just, I guess, a comment on who's in control of that time frame. And then Andrew Cook has a follow-on. I think it's related to the comment above. Timeframes can be affected by developer performance. How would you allow for this in setting KPIs? So I think in those two comments, there's a bit of detail about the actual setting of those timeframes. So one is there a timeframe setting that should be consistent across developers? Welcome to hear some views from that. And the second one is a lot of distributors will be reporting on performance based on, I guess, their own performance or their own actions. Can those performance be reflected, or those timeframes also reflect, I guess, developers' part in the process too? Now, I'll leave that there, see if there's any reflections. I know there's another question that's raised as well. And feel free not to raise your hand. I think we're all quite sensible here. So if you'd like to speak, just come off mute and respond.
Yeah, I might add a little bit more to what I put there around developers affecting performance. I think one of the issues that we face with measuring some of the timeframes for negotiated offers at the moment under the Chapter 5A obligation is the nuances with receiving customer information correctly, and our ability for a system to be able to continually record the back and forth that can sometimes happen between the distribution business and the developer or the customer, and then to be able to accurately report on what that turnaround time frame was. The developer is always going to have one view versus what we have as another view, because there has been that consistent back and forth to get the correct information to actually officially start the clock.
Yeah, okay. And so this really comes down to it's sort of a tracking exercise as well, I guess, of when you're...
And also a buy-in that there's going to be a set guideline that developers have to meet in order for those timeframes to be met. So if you're submitting information and one document's missing, then the DB should essentially be given a pass that we're not expected to meet that timeframe now.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than this having to figure out a way to remeasure once we finally do collect all of the information required. put some obligation back on the developers to actually perform as well.
So that really boils down to well-defined performance measures.
Yep. But not just looking at the DB in this case, it's actually looking at the developers and the customers and the information we receive from them.
I think that's probably fair enough, and I think that the development industry would be able to self-reflect enough in relation to the fact that we need to improve quality across the board. And if there is a piece of documentation missing with that original application, I suppose what we would appreciate is that you supply that missing piece of information, but then you don't get back to the back of the queue. You can still progress quickly with your application.
And yeah, that becomes a challenge in then meeting everyone else's timeframes if you're trying to hold slots in a queue while waiting for information, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'll observe about this discussion that the issues around the rigor of these sort of measures becomes more intense at the point at which they become targets rather than just something that you report and improve transparency about. And you can possibly create more transparency by having performance indicators attached to participants as well, which we have talked about from time to time, which should develop performance sitting side by side to help explain the performance story.
I think also you're going to get a better bite with voluntary reporting. We can focus on improving the overall customer experience. If there's set measures in place, then a lot of our time and effort needs to be focused on meeting those specific targets, which means that there is always going to be slip in other areas along the process because we want to make sure that we are getting those KPIs 100% of the time.
Why should the effort be different if it's regulated or voluntary?
Because we can actually focus on the overall end-to-end process and making sure that we're giving the best experience and taking the developer through every stage and holding their hand as we can, rather than going, right, well, we've got 40 days, we've got to make sure we meet that in this specific area. And as soon as that clock starts, we're gaming to make that 40 days.
So I think what we're sort of reflecting on is how you design these performance measures could, I guess, drive behavior in a sense, is what I'm hearing. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously there's public reporting happening already, but it sounds like that's been quite a positive thing so far. And are we looking just tweaks to that current arrangement? Or are we looking at like an overhaul of that performance reporting regime right now? Because it'd be one thing to take the voluntary reporting now and formalizing it. It'd be another thing to redesign it, if you will.
I know that when there are legislated requirements in terms of timeframes for councils to check plans, for example, that can be very useful for us, particularly when a particular council is not doing what they should be doing. Then at least you've got some sort of clout to go in there and say you're not meeting your timeframes.
And I guess I want to be accurate with our sort of words here in terms of timeframes. This is not the process that we're talking about is really about reporting on average performance. Timeframes would be an actual time period to which a connection needs to be done by. There's a few other questions about costs to the regime, more general questions. I think most people can read that in the group chat. Just wondering if there's any reflections on, I guess, the costs of something like introducing a formal regime of performance reporting. And also, I think a question about whether the standard timeframes could actually work for larger, more complex projects. Would it still apply?
Aaron, I think it would, from a distributor viewpoint, or certainly from the Power Core City Power viewpoint, and taking on board what Stephen said before, it would be interesting to hear the things that we're measuring now, and the developer view of whether we're in fact measuring the right things, or whether there's parts of the process that we're not measuring that they would like to see, and you know, have we missed something through this process that's, you know, like the plan certification that's glaringly obvious maybe? Is there something that we're not measuring that we should be?
And people might have thoughts immediately right now, or it could be through the submission process as well. I think we'd be welcome to hear that.
Yep.
I ask that question in the submission process for people to identify which stages are important to them.
Yeah. Now, I'm just conscious of time. I know there's a few other questions that people have put through. I might just ask if anyone has raised those ones, if that hasn't really been covered through our discussion, feel free to come off mute and ask or reflect on it.
Yeah, Craig Veldosnet Services here. I'm just quite concerned about, you know, the regime of, or the potential regime of compliance and the cost, as I mentioned, to deliver that reporting. And, you know, we have to at times put considerable effort into that, or alternately sometimes invest in a different IT to what we currently have. So that can cause DBs a bit of cost. So I'd be really interested to know, as Matt just quite rightly pointed out, you know, what are the real issues, and we're certainly available for roundtable, you know, open get-togethers, if you like, with developers of individual estates and the industry as they require. So I just get a little bit concerned when we put in a regulated approach, which can become very taxing to comply to.
Thanks, Craig. And I think, you know, going into the detail about what these metrics would be if it goes down this path, that sort of consultation would be needed. All right, we might hold it there. Feel free to ask questions or come back to it if you do. We might jump to the next approach.
Okay, I'll move on to approach C, which is our third approach, and it's a little different from the first two in the sense that it's a bit more holistic. It's really about the good governance and management of negotiated electricity connections. And what we would do in this sort of approach is put an overarching obligation, or what we're thinking of doing is putting an overarching obligation in our electricity distribution code, requiring distribution businesses to continue with the ongoing good management of these connections, and then support that obligation with some guidance on what we think the sort of things that distribution businesses should do to support and show that they're actually managing these connections in a sound way. Some of the things that we think that distribution businesses could do are very similar to some of the things that are already in the service improvement commitment. And they're obviously reviewing the public material to making sure it's, some ideas are reviewing the public material to make sure it's consistent with the current practices, establishing forums with developers to resolve issues and get to some of the root causes of problems, particularly things to do with quality. We could continue on with performance reporting, obviously, because there's some benefit in that, and we've seen that through this earlier discussion. Things like continually reviewing audit practices to make sure that they're efficient and generating the right results for both parties. Ongoing review of the performance indicators to make sure that they're regularly reviewed to make sure that they're up to date and meet stakeholder expectations and are measuring the right things. Looking at things like resourcing around connections to make sure that these connections are resourced appropriately, to make sure that we sort of don't fall back into a situation where we were about 18 months ago, where it appeared there was a shortage of staff to do work around connections. We could continue on improving the way the technical standards are measured And there's some of the ideas that went into the issues paper. Obviously, there'll be other things that people might think are important around good management. Some of those things that I've just talked about, you know, they may be done and dusted now. We may have progressed them far enough already, but they're just some starter ideas for people. Obviously, there could be penalties if DBs didn't comply with this overarching obligation. But again, that's a call for government, and we could obviously continue to monitor performance against delivering these initiatives around good governance, and see how they were tracking and whether or not further regulatory interventions warranted down the track. So option C is really a more holistic option, and it just doesn't focus on performance reporting solely.
Thanks, Marion. And just as context, we actually raised a similar idea to this as part of one of the previous governance committee. I think some of the members at the governance committee was looking for more details about what this would actually involve. So we tried to set this out in a bit more detail in the issues paper. I might just ask at this point, do you have any questions about this approach, and do you think it has any benefits if we go down this type of approach in setting an obligation on distributors?
Alex Harvey here from the Property Council. We've definitely heard from our members that a commercial approach should be taken, as seen in approach C. We just need to drive accountability, yet allow for some flexibility proportional to the size of developments.
Yep. So, there's I'm sort of hearing, Alex, there is a bit of a need there, but sort of a broader need to cater for different complex developments or simple developments?
Exactly, yeah. So just to allow flexibility, because there's different, you know, numbers of lots and to the actual complexity of a given lot.
Yeah. Craig's just asked a question. Would option C be intended for all customer classes or just developer works? I think the intention, Marion, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, I think the intention is for greenfield development.
It's greenfield.
Yeah.
But it's probably something that's quite flexible, and if there was a need, it could be extended to other sorts of developments.
Alex, I have a question about your comment. I'm really interested in your observation about the need to be sort of a commercial relationship. And this option's designed at thinking about governance and governance standards or management standards around commercial practice. What would you think would be the kind of key characteristics of that if you were to codify it in some way off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, well, I just believe mandated time frames, or, you know, being able to have a degree of flexibility, yet also have accountability to agreed upon time frames is really important, especially for developers who are trying to work to stringent time frames, because at the end of the day, this has a real impact on, you know, it has a real impact on the finances of a development if they're held up for extended periods of time. So it needs to be incentivized, yet at the same time, there needs to be, people need to be reprimanded for failing to meet timelines. Does that answer your question, John?
I think so. This option, as I understood it, was something more like you might put in place around sort of, say, the equivalent of directors' standards for governance in a corporation, or it's that kind of, what are your principles of good commercial practice that you're kind of wanting to see in the relationship. So it's more of a principle-based approach around management and organisational practice, if you see what I mean. So that's what I came to. It's sort of not an option that there's another option around time frames and penalties if you don't meet the time frame, which creates accountability from that angle. But this is more about kind of capturing the nature of what do you want in terms of business-to-business practices from a distribution business, and how would they operate?
Sorry, I might be getting my A and B confused there.
That's all right. I was talking about C. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, no, with C.
My sort of view, are you talking more here around flexibility for distribution businesses to be able to negotiate a contract that would be suitable for both the developer and the distribution business, rather than being locked into the current contracts that we have that are already approved by the AER?
Yes.
So with that, I mean, the one thing that stands out there is that there would need to be some incentive under those contracts to the DBs as well. It would be very one-sided, being that we're regulated, to be able to write in requirements for us to meet for the developer, yet not have the same equal rights back.
Of course, and that's what I mentioned before. It needs to be incentivized for both parties, and there also needs to be consequences for not meeting those targets.
Yeah, so that starts to deviate quite significantly from the Chapter 5A regulations.
And then the other thought is, I mean, are you talking about negotiated agreements that are bespoke to each development? Effectively,
That's the way I'm reading this.
That's what it would be trending to. Just doubling back.
Couldn't see AusNet being keen on this arrangement. We need to be pretty standard. I don't think we should be creating a regime where there's a special arrangement for a bigger or a smaller or whatever developer. It should be consistent in how it's approached.
Quite a lot of transaction costs as well in terms of the negotiation.
Potentially, exactly, and then we might get unreasonable request situations and all those sorts of things, which might impact our ability to deliver. So that's a concern. The other part about this too that seems to be a consistent issue at the moment is build quality, the construction quality, because this is turnkey, so the DB are receiving the constructed works, and we're our process is to ensure that we audit and monitor those service providers. But if there's significant delays caused by construction practices or poor civil works or all those sorts of things, that does impact the bottom line. But a lot of times the DB is not a contributor to that delay. But we're certainly involved at the end and feel the pressure when things are getting tight for the developer, which we understand cash flow. Just a comment.
There's no doubt, John Forbes here from Dennis Family, representing UDIA. There's no doubt that training of the contractors out on site is an area that needs a fair bit of work. Matt mentioned that earlier in the piece. I guess one of the things that needed to be unlocked first was availability of standards and so forth on site, and some work's been done in that space, but it's absolutely an area that needs further work. But the performance of someone on site or the contractor on site doesn't impact on the DB's time frames when it's their turn to contribute to the process.
Yeah, no, I accept that. It's just that it does contribute to the pressure button, I guess, and the pressure that the developer's feeling if they've had a cash flow impact somewhere prior to that interaction. So, which we get.
Now, I think there's just a comment on the group chat. We're talking about penalties and distributors for poor performance, but what penalties would apply to a developer for poor performance, i.e. not handing over the estate in a timely manner with all handover documentation?
I can assure you there's a fair financial penalty.
For yourselves.
I think, I think in our case though, we approve estates and certification and title release prior to full completion of the estate. So it's when it's energised. So we allow it to go through, and then we have a subsequent follow over of completion documents, as-built drawings, and all those sorts of things to complete the estate. And we have a number of projects that are outstanding beyond that period. So that is a cash flow issue for us because we can't recognise the assets on our books as well. So that's because we approved the statement of compliance prior to receiving all of that information. In AusNet's case, it may be different in other DBs.
So I might just double back to approach C, because I think we're sort of in this conversation, we're actually talking about negotiated agreements and timeframes and penalties. So I just want to double back on option C, if there's any other comments on it. Just to recap, option C is really about trying to put an obligation on distributors to sort of maintain their commitment to invest in the systems or their processes to make sure they're still providing good service. That's effectively what option C is. So maybe as a question to any of the developers or contractors here, is that a useful thing? Are there any downsides to that? Distributors, you might have a view as well. All right, we might leave it there. Feel free to jump out if you have any questions though, but we might jump to the next approach, Mary.
Thanks, Aaron. Approach D is our final approach, and that's actually about regulating the time it would take to complete certain steps in the negotiated connections process. We feel that this approach would most strongly incentivise DBs to complete stages or steps, all the contractors under its control to actually complete those stages or steps in the process, because they would have to complete them within maximum timeframes, otherwise penalties may apply. Now, we could probably do this in two different ways. Each and every time a particular step is undertaken, there's a maximum that must be undertaken within a maximum time frame. Or we could measure the number of times a particular step is taken over a period of time, and then work out the average time for each of those steps. If you take it, you could take an average across all the times that step was undertaken over a time, and that could be, say, over a year. So it could be that every year a DB has to complete a particular stage within a maximum time frame, and if they don't, then a penalty applies. Now, the key thing, and I think Andrew touched on this earlier, is that those sort of maximum timeframes may run counter to the intention of Chapter 5A, which is all about negotiating timeframes and negotiating the connection agreement. And that negotiated process allows for developers to have some flexibility about the amount of time it takes to do a certain step, and it also allows the developer and the DB to come to an arrangement where they agree on the time, whereas a maximum time frame is actually hard and fast, and that's the time that a particular step should take. If we were going to go down that path, we'd obviously have to take into account all the national rules that are in place around negotiated connections. So that would have to be something that we would have to carefully consider further if we went down that path. Obviously, if timeframes aren't met, then penalties could apply. But like for any of the approaches where we put obligations in our codes, they would have to be subject to government introducing those penalties. So that is approach D. Perhaps it most strongly would give developers certainty about how long certain steps are likely to would actually take to complete. So that probably hits the certainty point hardest. So that is that's approach D.
Thanks, Marion. So I think we've heard a lot about, I've heard a lot from, I guess, developers particularly about timeliness and certainty. From your experience, how would this approach sort of work with those issues? Are there any downsides to this is probably another question as well.
It's Elizabeth here from PowerCore. I just want to comment on this stage and note that not all the steps are in our control here, and some of the delays may be caused by the developer, for example, for not meeting safety obligations. As you know, we already have safety obligations to the ESB, and in terms of making sure our network is safe. So we wouldn't want to be compromising meeting our safety obligations to try and meet developer timeframes and being penalised for it. So I'm really hoping that could be taken into account.
It would be, and again, I think it goes back to actually having really clearly defined performance measures and making it really clear on all the conditions that must be met before we could measure that, measure the time validly.
So just going back, go for it, John.
I was just going to say, I guess, just in response to that, at this point in time, we haven't really discussed, I think Andrew Weber might have sort of flagged it in one of the chats, but we haven't really spoken about what the targets are. At this point in time, their targets, particularly with PowerCore, which is sort of where I have most of the experience, it's been targets they've set themselves. We haven't really sort of been involved as an industry in setting what those targets are at this point in time. So one would have thought that PowerCore would already have taken into consideration those internal safety considerations. I mean, a lot of the targets that we've discussed to date, or that are recorded to date, are about responding to the next step in the process. So, for instance, from the time an audit is requested to the time the audit is completed. Now, we accept that if the audit is not done correctly, then it's on the developer and their consultants and contractors to get it right. But those targets aren't directly related, from what I can see, to any safety sort of particular issue. So just another point with the 4 approaches. In each of the approaches, the timeframes need to be recorded, or there needs to be some system to actually determine what the timeframes are that have been met. So regardless of whether we're looking at approach A or D, A through to D, there's going to have to be some process in the background to determine the numbers, the timeframes. So it really, I mean, that cost is going to be there for the DBs, regardless of what outcome we come up with.
So I'm hearing, John, one of the key things here is actually the design of whatever measure or target or time frame we're doing. That's probably a key part in the detail, really, because I think Andrew's comment in the chat box is an interesting one about in each of these approaches, they could have different implications, I guess. So performance measure might be different to an actual regulated time frame where you say you have to achieve something in a certain time, and you might design different measures for different situations. So I guess one of my questions to the group here is, where do you think the needs are? And is it really about raising transparency and making sure that if we're raising transparency, those metrics are actually revealing the things that count the most? Or are we actually trying to make sure that things are done within a very set period of time for different connection stages?
It's Chris Mason here from Gemini. Just a quick comment. I mean, a lot of these discussions and these options are around, ensuring that DBs don't fall back into old habits. Right. So I just need to clarify. I mean, are we pushing for further improvement, or are we pushing to maintain the current level? Because I know we've improved quite significantly over the last 2 years, even more if you look further beyond the last 2 years. But is the message that we're trying to convey saying that we're happy with the DBs now and we want to continue that performance, or it's great, we've made some progress, but there's still a lot to develop, you know? And
yeah, Chris, you raise a good point, is that we want to sort of make sure we don't fall back into bad habits, and that's the industry as much as the DBs. I guess, you know, I haven't really sort of, you know, looked at each of the targets to understand if they're reasonable or what, but, you know, if there's simple improvements to be made, then they should be made. And I guess one of the things that this reporting has done, it's identified areas where we can improve, that we've shine a light on areas where, you know, there is an improvement. And so, you know, is it about improvement? Well, I guess yes, but, you know, that's got to be within reason. I don't know what that answer is, you know, in terms of what is the ultimate target.
Yeah.
As I say, at this point in time, it's pretty much been self-imposed targets by the DBs.
I think that's a really interesting observation about the targets being set by the businesses themselves. And it actually made me ponder something which I don't think we've got up here, which I was thinking about in the context of the AusNet Customer Service Panel, for example, and our own work that we've done in the water sector with the Primo sector, which is to create incentives for the businesses to engage with the customers, in this case, the development business, in setting the timeframes themselves. So rather than the regulator coming and saying, this is the target, what they expect that the incentive and the rule was around an expectation on the quality of engagement with the customer such that targets are set, and the incentive is to make those goals that you've agreed, which gives that kind of level of flexibility. And that might include targets, for example, but it's essentially would also create an avenue for having performance improvement as well. So I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts about that, which would kind of have an outcome coming out of this process that was about improved relationships between the distribution businesses and their customers, in this case, the development industry, that might include targets or public reporting and transparency against those goals that are agreed at a sort of commercial level. There's a sort of a third thought that I randomly come up with in the middle of a forum. But I'm interested in any thoughts about that. Catch you on the hoof.
John, it's Elizabeth here from City Power or UE again. I think that's a really great initiative that you're suggesting, which is to create incentives for us to engage with our developer customers and come up with metrics that may suit their needs better. I'm not hearing a clear view on this call today about what they really want in terms of improved reporting. And I think that maybe different developers may have different requirements, and therefore, and it may be that we can actually provide greater transparency in terms of how different, say, design houses are meeting timeframes, so maybe a greater transparency of that level of detail. And maybe that's something we can discuss commercially. And I think, therefore, what you're proposing may work better than any regulated timeframes.
What happens in the Primo framework, or in the maybe someone from AusNet would care to comment on the customer panel, which is you agree with the customer panel on what the targets would be and then commit to it. So it's not as if there are no targets or no timeframes, but they come out of the engagement with the customer to reflect the customer needs as a group and via, say, a customer panel or something of that nature. And the regulatory oversight is to ensure that that process is happening and that it's robust. I apologise to my team for creating another option on the hoof.
I think it's an amalgamation of options B, C, and D.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an option C actually. It's probably option C leading to an expectation that targets or goals might be set through that governance and management process.
But just, oh, sorry, you go.
You go,
Chris. I'm just sort of thinking about that, and you know, because we're talking about targets at the moment, and there's an assumption there that, you know, if we're talking about improving targets and maybe tightening them up, that we're doing all the right things now, and you know, the gains are to be got by getting better at what we're currently doing. Whereas I look at what we've done over the last, you know, it's only been a reasonably short period, the last 2 years. I actually think the big changes are probably still in process rather than in performance around what we're doing now. There's still some things that maybe as an industry we can do a little bit differently that might give bigger gains than doing what we currently do faster, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree, Matt.
Stephen, did you have a comment?
I was just going to make a couple of comments when that was related to the fact that sometimes the developers feel they've got nowhere to go. So if they're not getting a response from the power company, is it possible to have some sort of independent ombudsman or someone who they could talk to about a particular issue? That's just one idea. And secondly, in the past, we were able to get statement of compliance when there was things identified in the final audits. And then we could correct any defects in a defect period, which doesn't seem to happen so much anymore. And I think that might take a lot of the heat out of some of the issues at the end of the process if you were able to fix minor defects in that period.
Thanks, Stephen.
Aaron, sorry, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Sort of picking up on what Stephen has just noted about, you know, if there are issues of contention between the distributor and the applicant. To what degree are we engaging or have we engaged with the AER's, I suppose, dispute resolution process under Chapter 5A? And has that worked?
Can I ask another question? To what extent have we escalated within the DBs these issues?
Yeah, that's probably a good question, and probably a better understanding of the structure of the DB and who you actually can speak to about any problem would be useful. In terms of the AER, I'm not aware of any time that we've used it. But the developers on the call might have.
Your sound's dropped out, Stephen.
I don't even know what the AR is.
Oh, we've got somebody from the AR on the line. So, well, are you joking?
No.
Okay. So the Australian, the acronym stands for the Australian Energy Regulator. So the Australian Energy Regulator is the regulator responsible for enforcing compliance with Chapter 5A. So Chapter 5A is what we keep referring to. These are a set of rules that sit in the National Electricity Rules. And so under those rules, there's a provision which most of parties engage in, which is a negotiated contract, negotiated connection. Those rules provide that if there is a dispute, that you can engage with the AER. So that's why I'm just sort of wanting to tease out whether or not that process is being used.
From a developer's perspective, we're simple developers. We don't understand the industry. We don't understand Chapter 5.
And John, I would expect that you would, you obviously know Andrew reasonably well, and half the industry knows Andrew from the AusNet point of view. But certainly, I would expect that developers, should they have issues, would be going through the DBs and following escalation processes through those DBs, rather than going to the independent umpire all the time. If there's issues to correct, you don't know about them sometimes, specific little things, and you can't make adjustments if you're unaware of them until they end up in a forum with a whole bunch of people going, gee, this happened to me, that happened to me, and the next thing happened to me. So that's, it's an important thing to open those that dialogue doors.
And
You already
I
got
guess,
a project manager.
Yeah, and I guess, some of us have very good relationships with people on this call and can make those phone calls. I guess, we've been talking about the last 2 years. Well, Stephen and I have probably been knocking down this door for the last 4 or 5 years. And when it started, the DBs didn't even rate developers as customers because that's not where the money's been made. So a lot of it is about relationship building. But my concern is what happens when we're old and grey and we're no longer in the positions we are, and there are new people who haven't been involved in this process and don't understand where we've come from. What happens then? That's my concern. So, what we're trying to do now is establish a regime that is going to have some longevity, regardless of the personalities sitting either side of the table.
Yeah, fair comment.
Hello. Just on that, I think it'd be good. I've been in the industry now 10 years, always concentrated on customer initiated works. For the developers to actually come out from behind their contractors and consultants and engage directly with us as well, because the door's there, we're open to it. But a lot of the time, the only line of communication we have is the plan Bs and power plants of the world. The developers don't want to talk to us because you're already paying someone in the middle.
Sometimes that's because we're required to nominate a PM2 and that the communication has to come through the PM2. So I think it's potentially enforced by the system too.
From a Gemini perspective, we're open always to have a conversation directly with the developers and encourage it, but often don't receive the that conversation when we want it.
Hello, David Chen from the AEL. So there's no way that I can raise my hand, so probably I just turn on my video. Hope that you can see, but probably in a high level sense that the AEL's role under Chapter 5A, which is actually repeated in the National Electricity Victorian Rule. Chapter 5A of the National Electricity Rule does not apply in Victoria, but it's been repeated in the Victorian legislation. The AEL's role is to resolve dispute in the connection, setting up the connection agreement. So which is the first step of the application. And under the current rule under Chapter 5A, the time frame is very long. So I don't think would under the current legislation, I don't think would really help. And also, in addition, what I understanding is that the issue comes up to about inspection, testing, certifying, design. They're part of the contract document. It's a contract management and contract dispute issue rather than a connection, the connection agreement issue. So it's something that contract dispute that the AEL does not have power to resolve. Is but I think that the developer and the business have been doing great work in trying to improve the contract management phase of the construction. So I would support that there's a round table between the developer and distributor, at least identify where the key points are, and then it can move on to develop those targets and the measures and whatnot. The only concern I have that if you have a very hard timeline for each step, that means you could potentially, if not managed well, you could potentially end up with a finger pointing. And you haven't given it in time, and where does the clock start? So I would strongly support that start with a round table to find out each party's interests and issues. So happy to answer questions.
David, I'm just conscious of time, but I feel like we've sort of rounded off the conversation in an interesting way, particularly about John, especially your reflections on actually what might be needed. And it sounds like there's really an oversight of, or a framework to ensure that what I think is a collaborative arrangement that's happening right now is actually cemented in, put in place. There's actually some guardrails for that, and probably appropriate guardrails, I think, is the way that we have to characterize that. That's at least what I've heard. So sort of leave any other reflections if anyone might have.
Yeah, I'd agree, Aaron. I think one of the things that resonated with me is what John said, we need a regime with longevity. So something that's going to stay in place and continue and encourage continued improvement over the long term and good relationships.
All right, Aaron, does that bring us to the end of the discussion, does it?
Yes, it does.
Excellent. Look, I'd really like to thank you all for your contribution today, and particularly the very constructive spirit within which everyone engaged on these options. And it's clearly we've got some more thinking and work to do, and we're really looking forward to your submissions and further thought on it. I did particularly, so some of the things I heard from you all today was about recognition of the progress to date, the importance of the economic recovery and the building industry for that, and how the connections process generally from Danny, both here and in other utilities, is critical for that recovery. Concerns about the voluntary nature of the compliance, and I guess the ongoing theme around that is how do we make that sustainable and not dependent on individual relationships. Even though as individual relationships are developed through this process, we need to find a way of removing that dependence. And for me, that's often about good processes, about good outcomes that bed in those relationships for the future. Concerns about issues that might happen and disputes that might occur and clock stopping, concerns about costs, but also a recognition generally of the absolute importance of this work for everyone in the room. Thank you all again for your contributions, and it's certainly given us feed for thought, and really appreciate the time that you've given to us today. If you would like to follow up on anything from today, please reach out to Aaron or Merrin. And a reminder that written submissions close on the issues paper on the 7th of August. And depending on where we land on that decision, on that process, will depend on the next steps after that. So thank you all, and I hope you have a safe and healthy weekend and rest of the week.